My name is Sydney and I am 30 years old. I work as a real estate appraiser, a practical career that my family always considered a massive disappointment. But I never imagined my practicality would lead my own parents to drag me into a courtroom. I was just carrying the last box of dishes into my new house when a man handed me a lawsuit. When I confronted my parents, they looked me dead in the eye and demanded I hand over the deed because the house belonged to my golden child brother. They did not expect my response, and after that day, nothing in my family was ever the same again. Before I dive into this mess, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against a toxic family. Growing up in the Chicago suburbs, the dynamic in our household was always painfully clear. My older brother Preston was the undisputed king. Whatever Preston wanted, Preston got. He was 34 years old and styled himself as a flashy entrepreneur, always launching some new venture that inevitably crashed into a mountain of debt. Meanwhile, I chose stability. I worked hard, paid my own way through school, and built a solid career appraising properties. Naturally, my parents, Richard and Patricia, viewed my independence as a direct insult to Preston's grandiose but hollow lifestyle. They constantly covered his tracks, paid his bills, and treated me like an invisible roommate. It was a brisk Tuesday afternoon when the fragile illusion of our family finally shattered. I was sweating through my shirt, hauling a heavy cardboard box up the front steps of my very first home. It was a foreclosure property I had scored at a county auction. It needed a lot of work. The drywall was damaged, the plumbing was ancient, and it desperately needed a complete kitchen overhaul. But it had incredible bones and a sprawling backyard. More importantly, it was mine. I had spent months scouting listings, doing the math, and saving every spare cent for the exact right moment to bid. I was so incredibly proud of myself. I had just set the heavy box down on the dusty living room floor when the doorbell rang. I wiped my forehead, expecting a delivery driver or maybe a friendly neighbor coming to introduce themselves. Instead, a man in a bland gray suit was standing on my porch holding a thick manila envelope. He asked if I was Sydney. When I nodded, he shoved the envelope against my chest, muttered that I had been served, and walked briskly back to his car. My hands were shaking as I ripped the paper open. I stared at the legal jargon, my brain struggling to process the words printed on the stark white page. Civil summons, breach of contract, tortious interference. And then I saw the names of the plaintiffs, Richard and Patricia. My own parents were suing me. I scanned further down the page, my breath catching in my throat. The lawsuit claimed that I had maliciously intercepted a real estate transaction intended for my brother. They were literally taking me to court over the house I was standing in. I did not even bother locking the front door. I threw the papers onto the passenger seat of my car and drove straight to my parents' house. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel. My mind was racing with a million questions, but underneath the confusion was a boiling, undeniable rage. I had bought that house through a public county auction. It was a standard foreclosure. There was no secret deal, no malicious interception. I pulled into their pristine driveway and marched right up to the front door, pushing it open without knocking. I found them exactly where I expected, sitting in the formal living room like they were holding court. My father Richard was sipping coffee in his leather recliner. My mother Patricia was casually flipping through a magazine. And sitting on the sofa across from them, looking as smug as ever, was Preston. He was acting exactly like a spoiled teenager who had just tattled to mommy and daddy to get his way. "What is this?" I demanded, slamming the crumpled lawsuit onto the glass coffee table. The loud smack made my mother jump, but my father simply set his mug down with infuriating calm. "It is exactly what it looks like, Sydney," my father said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We are taking legal action to correct a massive mistake you made." Preston crossed his arms and leaned back into the sofa cushions. "You had no right to bid on that property," he sneered. "You knew I was looking for a new house. You stole my deal out from under me." I stared at him in pure disbelief. "Are you out of your mind?" I yelled. "It was a public county foreclosure auction. I did not even know you were looking at houses. You do not even have the credit score to buy a used car right now, let alone outbid me in a cash auction." Preston's face flushed bright red, his arrogant facade cracking just a fraction. My mother stood up quickly, smoothing the front of her expensive blouse, rushing to protect her golden boy. "Do not speak to your brother that way," she snapped. "We had an arrangement with the bank to acquire that specific property for Preston. We were handling it quietly. And then you had to go and stick your nose where it does not belong, using your little appraiser tricks to buy it." She reached into a folder on the side table and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it across the glass toward me. "This is a deed transfer agreement," she said coldly. "You are going to sign the house over to Preston today. We will reimburse you for what you paid at the auction, minus the legal fees we had to spend to draft these documents. If you sign it right now, we will drop the lawsuit and forget this whole ugly display of jealousy ever happened." I looked down at the deed transfer, then back up at the three people who were supposed to be my family. They were completely serious. They genuinely believed they could bully me into handing over my hard-earned property just because Preston wanted it. The sheer entitlement of it all took my breath away. "I am not signing anything," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I bought that house legally with my own money. If you want it, you can buy it from me for double what I paid. Otherwise, I will see you in court." I turned on my heel and headed for the door, my heart pounding against my ribs. I had my hand on the doorknob when my mother lost her temper. Her voice, shrill and desperate, echoed through the foyer. "You have no right to touch the assets of the family trust." I froze. My hand tightened on the brass knob. The air in the room suddenly felt very heavy. I slowly turned around to face her. My father was glaring at my mother, looking as if he wanted to cover her mouth. Preston had gone completely pale. "A family trust," I asked, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. In 30 years, I had never heard a single mention of a family trust. My parents were wealthy, sure, but they had always claimed their money was tied up in their own retirements and businesses. There had never been a trust, at least not one they ever told me about. The silence in the room was deafening. My mother looked horrified by her own words, realizing she had just revealed something massive. I did not say another word. I opened the door and walked out to my car. But as I drove away, my mind was putting the pieces together: the foreclosed house, the secret deal with the bank, the lawsuit, and now a hidden family trust. I knew I had to use every professional skill I possessed to dig into that property's history, because my family was hiding a massive secret, and I was about to blow it wide open. I did not sleep a single wink that night. The phrase my mother had screamed at me in the foyer echoed in my head on a relentless, maddening loop. "You have no right to touch the assets of the family trust." Those words were a slipped mask, a crack in the foundation of the pristine, carefully curated reality my parents presented to the world. I paced the hardwood floors of my empty living room until the sun began to peek over the Chicago skyline. As soon as it was light out, I grabbed my keys and headed straight to my office. As a licensed real estate appraiser, my job involves a lot more than just walking through a house and measuring square footage. I am trained to look at the paper trail, the digital footprints left behind by decades of property transactions, tax assessments, and deed transfers. Most people see a house as walls and a roof. I see it as a financial timeline. I arrived at the firm 2 hours before anyone else. The office was dead silent, save for the low hum of the air conditioning. I dropped my bag onto my chair, booted up my dual monitors, and logged directly into the restricted county property database. My hands were surprisingly steady as I typed in the address of the foreclosure I had just purchased. I needed to know what made this specific rundown house so valuable to my parents that they were willing to serve their own daughter with a lawsuit. The loading icon spun for a few seconds before the comprehensive property history populated on my screen. I bypassed my own recent transaction with the bank and began scrolling backward through the chain of title. I moved past the notice of default, past the bank seizure documents, looking for the last recorded individual owner. When my eyes landed on the name printed on the original deed, the breath was knocked completely out of my lungs. Beatrice Hayes. I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to process the information. Beatrice was my grandmother on my father's side. She had passed away 4 years ago. After her funeral, my father had sat the family down and solemnly explained that her estate was completely bankrupt. He claimed she had quietly racked up astronomical medical debts and reverse mortgages, leaving absolutely nothing behind. He told us the bank was seizing her property to cover her liabilities and that it was a tragic, unavoidable end to her legacy. I had mourned her deeply, accepting the story without a second thought. But looking at the digital records illuminating my dark office, a very different, much more sinister story began to unfold. I opened the property tax records and cross-referenced them with the lien history. The house had been fully paid off. There was no reverse mortgage. Instead, there was a sudden, deliberate halt in property tax payments that began exactly 1 month after my grandmother passed away. I dug into the utility records and the municipal notices. The house had not been seized because of unavoidable medical debt. It had been intentionally starved of payments. Someone had purposefully let the property slide into delinquency. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. If a property is passed down through a standard inheritance or a legal will, it becomes subject to probate court. It gets divided among legal heirs, which would have naturally included me. But if a property falls into severe tax delinquency and goes into bank foreclosure, it is wiped clean. The foreclosure process legally extinguishes any prior family claims, essentially washing the asset. My parents had deliberately forced my grandmother's fully paid-off home into foreclosure. Their plan was brilliant in its cruelty. By letting the bank take the house, they erased my legitimate claim to my inheritance. Then they intended to use their insider connections, or a shell company, to quietly purchase the property back at a closed bank auction for pennies on the dollar. Once they secured it for a fraction of its actual value, they were going to place the deed directly into Preston's name. They engineered a complex financial laundering scheme just to hand their golden child a free house while ensuring I got absolutely nothing. The only flaw in their flawless criminal strategy was me. They never anticipated that I would be monitoring county foreclosure auctions for my own investments. They never expected that I would recognize the value in the property's bones and submit a blind winning cash bid before they could finalize their backdoor deal with the bank. I had unknowingly hijacked their massive fraud by simply showing up and doing my job. I pushed my chair back from the desk, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs. The betrayal was so profound it made me physically nauseous. They had not just favored my brother. They had actively conspired to rob me of my grandmother's legacy. They had manufactured a fake bankruptcy to hoard wealth for a 34-year-old man who could not even hold down a basic job. And when I accidentally interrupted their scheme, their immediate response was to drag me into court and attempt to bully me into signing the deed over hoping I would submit to their authority like I always did when I was younger. But I was no longer the quiet, compliant girl who accepted their emotional neglect. I was a professional who knew exactly how to trace a financial crime. I leaned forward, gripping the edge of my desk, my eyes locked on the undeniable proof glowing on my monitor. They wanted to play games with property law. They wanted to weaponize the legal system against me to protect their precious son. I was going to show them exactly what happens when you underestimate the daughter you spent 30 years treating like a failure. I reached for my mouse, ready to download and print every single document in the chain of title. I needed hard copies. I needed an impenetrable paper trail to hand over to a lawyer who would tear my parents' lawsuit to shreds. Just as I clicked the print icon, my cell phone began to vibrate violently across the surface of my desk, snapping me out of my intense focus. I glanced down at the caller ID, expecting it to be my mother calling to issue another round of threats. Instead, a very different name flashed on the screen, signaling that the nightmare was only just beginning. I knew exactly where to find them. My mother had bragged about it endlessly on social media the week prior. Preston was hosting a lavish invite-only dinner party at one of the most exclusive steakhouses in downtown Chicago to prematurely celebrate his upcoming real estate acquisition. He was toasting to a house he did not own, funded by money he did not have, using a credit score he had stolen from me. The sheer audacity of it made my grip on the steering wheel white-hot as I navigated through the evening traffic. I pulled up to the restaurant and tossed my keys to the valet. I was still wearing my tailored office attire, but I did not care about fitting into their black tie aesthetic. The restaurant was a fortress of mahogany and brass, smelling of aged beef and expensive cigars. I marched past the host stand, ignoring the polite protests of the maitre d', and headed straight for the private dining room at the back of the establishment. I pushed the heavy oak doors open, and the lively chatter in the room instantly died. There they were. Preston sat at the head of a long table flanked by Richard and Patricia. Crystal wine glasses caught the ambient light, and premium cuts of meat sat half-eaten on porcelain plates. Preston was surrounded by his usual sycophants fellow aspiring businessmen who bought into his illusion of wealth. And sitting quietly to his right was Nia. She caught my eye immediately, her posture rigid, her expression a mix of exhaustion and deep suspicion. She had not forgotten our morning phone call. "Sydney," my father barked, half rising from his chair. His face flushed a deep, angry red. "What is the meaning of this? You are not invited here." I stepped fully into the room, letting the heavy doors shut behind me. The silence was thick, suffocating, but I did not break eye contact with my father. "I am not here for a meal, Richard," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the room. "I am here to give you one single warning. You are going to drop the lawsuit against me regarding my grandmother's house by tomorrow morning. If you do not, I promise you I will tear your entire lives apart." A collective gasp rippled through the guests. Preston scoffed, leaning back in his chair and swirling the red wine in his glass. "Are you really doing this right now?" Preston sneered, looking around the table as if inviting his friends to share in his amusement. "You are crashing my celebration because you are throwing a tantrum over a business deal you lost. It is pathetic, Sid. Truly pathetic." My mother. Patricia stood up, her designer jewelry clinking as she smoothed the front of her silk dress. She turned to the guests with a practiced, patronizing sigh. "I apologize to everyone for this embarrassing display," she said, her voice dripping with venom, masked as maternal concern. "My daughter has always struggled with her brother's success. She is 30 years old, completely alone, and stuck in a dead-end job. I suppose seeing Preston achieving so much, buying his dream home, building a beautiful family, it has simply pushed her over the edge. She simply cannot handle that she will never have what he has." The guests murmured in agreement, casting pitying glances my way. My parents were using their audience exactly as they always did, weaponizing public humiliation to break my spirit. They wanted me to feel small. They wanted me to feel like the crazy, jealous spinster sister who was ruining a lovely evening because she was bitter. "You need professional help, Sydney," my father added, shaking his head. "We offered you a fair buyout for the property you tried to steal from your own brother. Instead of accepting our grace, you come here and make a fool of yourself. We will not drop the lawsuit. In fact, after this little stunt, we are going to press for damages. Now get out before I have security throw you into the street." I stood my ground, letting their insults wash over me like water off a stone. A younger version of me would have cried. A younger version of me would have yelled about the stolen Social Security numbers, screamed about the massive defaulted loans, and laid all my cards on the table right then and there out of pure emotional desperation. I wanted so badly to scream that Preston was a fraud, that he was bankrupting me to pay for this very dinner. But I was not that girl anymore. I was a professional who knew that the element of surprise was the most valuable asset in any negotiation. I needed them to think they had the upper hand. I needed them to keep digging their own graves in civil court before I dropped the federal fraud anvil on their heads. Letting them know I had uncovered the identity theft would only give them time to destroy evidence or flee. I did not say a single word in response to their mockery. Instead, I shifted my gaze directly to Nia. She was sitting perfectly still, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She was not laughing with the other guests. She was not nodding along with my mother's cruel narrative. Nia was looking at the expensive designer suit Preston was wearing. She was looking at the $200 bottles of wine on the table. And then she looked back at me. I could see the gears turning behind her sharp, intelligent eyes. The declined credit cards from this morning. The overdrawn accounts. The phantom business loans she had uncovered. Naya was brilliant and she was officially connecting the dots. She realized that the lavish lifestyle Preston was flaunting to this room full of people was a complete and utter fabrication built on stolen funds. I held Nia's gaze for a long, heavy moment. A silent mutual understanding passed between us. She knew I had the answers she was desperately looking for, and I knew she was the inside ally I would need to finish this. She gave me the tiniest, barely perceptible nod. I turned my attention back to my parents and my brother. They were practically glowing with self-satisfaction, completely convinced they had successfully shamed me into submission. They thought my silence was defeat. "Do not say I did not warn you," I said, my voice deadly calm. "Enjoy the wine, Preston. It might be the last glass you ever drink outside of a visitation room." I turned on my heel and walked out of the private dining room, leaving a stunned, breathless silence in my wake. I ignored the whispers of the restaurant staff as I strode out the front doors and into the cool night air. My heart was pounding, but my mind was crystal clear. My family thought they had won the battle by humiliating me in public. They thought their pristine reputation would shield them from consequence. But as I got back into my car and gripped the steering wheel, I knew the truth. They had just sealed their own fate, and their spectacular downfall was officially in motion. The adrenaline from the restaurant wore off somewhere around 2 in the morning. I finally managed to fall into a restless, exhausted sleep, only to wake up a few hours later, feeling like I had been hit by a freight train. I brewed a pot of strong black coffee and stood at the kitchen counter of my empty, foreclosed house. The silence of the morning felt heavy, thick, with the anticipation of whatever retaliation my family was cooking up. I knew they would not take my public defiance lightly. I had embarrassed them in front of their wealthy peers, and in my family, protecting the public image was the only religion they practiced. I opened my laptop to check my work emails, expecting a quiet morning. Instead, an unread message sat at the very top of my inbox. It was sent from a high-end downtown law firm. The subject line read, "Urgent legal notice regarding the estate of Beatrice Hayes." I set my coffee mug down. My hands were suddenly clammy. I clicked the email open and began to read. It was a formal demand letter, but it was written with the vicious, theatrical tone of a threat. My parents had officially escalated the war. The lawsuit they had served me yesterday was a civil dispute over real estate, but this new letter crossed a terrifying line. Their lawyer stated that if I did not sign the deed of the house over to Preston within 48 hours, they would be filing criminal charges against me. The charge they were threatening was felony elder abuse. I read the paragraph 3 times, my brain struggling to process the sheer audacity of the lie. The letter spun a wild, entirely fabricated narrative. It claimed that I had used my professional background in real estate to systematically isolate my grandmother in her final months of life. It accused me of manipulating a sick elderly woman into signing away her rights, coercing her into letting the property fall into foreclosure so that I could swoop in and steal it at a public auction years later. It was a complete and utter fiction. My grandmother had spent her final year in a secure memory care facility placed there by my parents, who had actively restricted my visiting hours under the guise of keeping her calm. I had not spoken to her about real estate money or wills. But my parents were twisting the timeline, weaponizing my career as an appraiser to paint me as a calculating predator. They were threatening to forward this fabricated evidence to the district attorney. They were willing to put their own daughter in a state penitentiary just to secure a free house for my brother. The realization hit me like a bucket of ice water. I was entirely out of my depth. I could track property deeds and uncover financial fraud, but I was not equipped to fight a fabricated criminal charge. I needed a lawyer. And I did not just need someone to review contracts. I needed a monster. I needed someone who ate arrogant, wealthy bullies for breakfast. I spent the next hour tapping into my professional network. I called commercial brokers, seasoned property managers, and title agents I had worked with over the past 8 years. I asked every single one of them for the most ruthless, relentless civil litigator in the city of Chicago. 3 different people gave me the exact same name, Bradley. By 10 in the morning, I was sitting in a polished glass-walled conference room in a high-rise overlooking the Chicago River. Bradley walked into the room carrying a legal pad and a cup of black coffee. He was in his mid-40s, wearing a sharp, tailored suit with silver at his temples and a piercing, analytical gaze. He did not offer small talk or pleasantries. He sat down, looked me in the eye, and told me to start from the beginning. I laid every single card on the table. I told him about the foreclosure auction, the deed transfer demand, and my mother slipping up about the family trust. I handed him the printed property records proving my parents intentionally starved my grandmother's house of taxes. Then I slid my newly printed credit report across the table, highlighting the 3 massive defaulted business loans Preston had taken out under my Social Security number. Finally, I handed him a printed copy of the elder abuse threat I had received that morning. Bradley read through the demand letter. He did not flinch. He reviewed the property records and the credit report, his eyes scanning the fraudulent loan amounts. When he finally looked up, a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "They are playing a very stupid game of chicken," Bradley said, tossing the demand letter onto the table. "This elder abuse claim is pure intimidation. It is a bluff designed to terrify you into signing away the house before the discovery phase of the civil lawsuit begins. Because they know that the second we enter discovery, I am going to subpoena Preston's business accounts." I leaned forward, my heart racing. Can they actually have me arrested? Bradley shook his head. No prosecutor is going to touch a 5-year-old elder abuse claim based on hearsay from parents who conveniently want the property for themselves. Especially not when we show the prosecutor that your brother committed felony identity theft to fund his lifestyle. Your parents are banking on your compliance. They think you will fold. So what is our defense strategy? I asked. We do not play defense, Sydney, Bradley replied smoothly. We play offense. I am taking your case. We are going to countersue them for malicious prosecution and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We are going to drag Preston into this suit for fraud and identity theft. But to crush them completely, I need hard proof of where that stolen loan money went. We have the credit report, but I need to link the stolen funds directly to Preston's personal spending or your parents' bank accounts. I need an inside look at his finances. I left Bradley's office feeling a surge of genuine power. For the first time since this nightmare began, I was not just reacting to my family's attacks. I had a shark in my corner, and we were preparing to strike. But as I drove back to my empty, foreclosed house, Bradley's final instruction weighed heavily on my mind. I needed undeniable internal proof of Preston's financial desperation. I had no idea how I was going to bypass my brother's security or get my hands on his private bank statements. The sky had darkened and a heavy cold rain began to fall as I pulled into my driveway. The house looked imposing in the gloom. I grabbed my bag and hurried up the walkway, my mind buzzing with legal strategies and financial timelines. I was reaching for my front door key when a pair of headlights suddenly swept across my lawn. A car had pulled up tight against the curb, the engine cutting off abruptly. I froze on the porch, my pulse spiking. I turned to look as the car door swung open. A figure stepped out into the pouring rain, pulling a coat tightly around their shoulders, and began walking rapidly toward my front steps. I squinted through the heavy sheets of rain as the figure hurried up my driveway. When she stepped under the amber glow of my porch light, my breath caught in my throat. It was Nia. She was shivering violently, her clothes completely soaked, clutching a thick leather tote bag to her chest like a shield. I quickly unlocked the door and pulled her inside out of the storm. I locked the deadbolt behind her and grabbed a towel from the hall closet. Nia did not say a word as I wrapped it around her shoulders. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, but the tears had already dried. In their place was a hardened, blistering anger that radiated from her entirely. Preston left for the country club an hour ago to celebrate with your father, Nia finally said, her voice eerily calm and stripped of all emotion. I waited until his car turned out of the neighborhood. Then I took a hammer to the biometric safe he keeps bolted to the floor in his home office. She walked past me into the kitchen and dropped the heavy leather tote bag onto the island counter. She unzipped it and began pulling out stacks of paper, dumping them across the marble surface. Dozens of bank statements, wire transfer receipts, and printed emails spilled out. "You were right, Sydney," she said, leaning over the counter and pointing to the top document. "He is completely bankrupt. His business accounts have been drained for months. But that is not what brought me here tonight." Nia slid a specific bank statement toward me. I looked down and recognized the heading. It was her and Preston's joint marital savings account. The balance at the bottom of the page was 0. "I checked the transaction history," Nia continued, her voice trembling with a fresh wave of rage. "I have spent the last 5 years putting 60% of my accounting salary into that specific account. It was our emergency fund. It was the down payment for our future children. He drained it. He forged my signature on a withdrawal slip and emptied every single penny. I felt a sickening knot twist in my stomach. Nia, I am so sorry. Where did he send it?" Nia slammed her finger down on a highlighted line item. "Look at the payee." I squinted at the text. It was a wire transfer for $80,000. The recipient was a downtown law firm, the exact same law firm representing Richard and Patricia in their lawsuit against me. "He stole my money to pay his parents' lawyers," Nia said, her voice echoing in the empty kitchen. "He robbed his own wife to fund a frivolous lawsuit against his sister, all so your parents can bully you into giving him a house he cannot even afford." The sheer depravity of it left me speechless for a moment. My parents and Preston were operating like a criminal syndicate. They did not care who they destroyed as long as Preston got his way. Nia gripped the edge of the kitchen island, her knuckles turning white. "I sat at their dinner table for years, Sydney. I put up with your mother's passive-aggressive comments. I ignored your father looking down on me. I worked twice as hard as anyone in that family to build a solid career as a Black woman in corporate accounting, and they treated my financial stability like it was a prop for Preston's ego. They smiled in my face while they helped him steal my future." I reached across the counter and grabbed her hand. I looked her dead in the eye. "They did the exact same thing to me, Nia. I checked my credit report this morning. Preston stole my social security number. He took out over $400,000 in commercial loans under my name to keep his fake businesses afloat, and Richard and Patricia know all about it." Nia stared at me, the shock slowly washing away, leaving nothing but cold, calculated resolve. We were two women who had been chronically underestimated, dismissed, and exploited by the exact same people. We had both played by the rules our entire lives, only to be robbed blind by a family that believed laws did not apply to them. "I hired a lawyer this morning," I told her, keeping my voice low and steady. "His name is Bradley. He is a monster in the courtroom. We are not just defending my house, Nia. We are going to countersue them for malicious prosecution, and we are dragging Preston in for felony identity theft. But Bradley told me he needed one thing to make the case airtight. He needed internal, undeniable proof of Preston's financial ruin. He needed to link their fraud directly to their spending." I gestured to the mountain of bank statements and wire transfers spread across my kitchen island. "You just brought me the exact ammunition we need to destroy them." Nia looked at the documents, then back at me. The brilliant, meticulous accountant inside her completely took over. Her posture straightened, and the vulnerability she carried in from the storm vanished. "If we are going to do this, we do not leave a single stone unturned," Nia said, her eyes flashing with a dangerous intensity. "Preston thought I was just a naive wife who would blindly trust his financial posturing. Your parents thought you were a weak target who would sign over your property out of fear. We are going to burn their entire fake empire to the ground." I nodded, feeling the first true surge of victory. We officially had an alliance. With Nia's financial expertise and Bradley's legal ruthlessness, my parents and Preston stood absolutely no chance. "But we are not finished yet," Nia said, unzipping a hidden compartment inside her leather tote bag. "Because while I was cleaning out his safe, I found something else. Something Preston went to great lengths to hide from me, and I think it is the key to figuring out exactly how they stole your grandmother's estate." Nia reached into the hidden pocket of her leather tote bag and pulled out a small, flat object. She placed it delicately onto the cold marble of my kitchen island. It was a silver key, distinctly shaped and stamped with a serial number. "I found it taped beneath the velvet lining at the very bottom of the safe," Nia explained, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Preston is arrogant, but he is also predictable. He thinks I never look past the top layer of anything. But I am an accountant. I look at everything. I also found the billing receipt for the rental fee. It is for a premier safe deposit box at a private wealth management bank right in the financial district. I stared at the silver key glinting under the kitchen pendant lights. A safe deposit box was the ultimate hiding spot. It was off the grid, immune to standard digital hacking, and completely invisible to anyone who did not know it existed. If my parents and Preston had orchestrated a massive legal and financial fraud to steal my grandmother's estate, the original forged documents, the blueprints of their entire criminal enterprise, would be locked inside that box. Can we even get into it? I asked, looking up at her. We have the key, but banks are heavily regulated. They do not just let anyone walk into a vault. Nia offered a sharp, confident smile. They do if you are the legal spouse of the account holder and you know exactly which legal loopholes to exploit. Preston used funds from our joint marital checking account to pay the annual rental fee for the box. I have the routing number, the receipt, my state identification, and my marriage certificate. In the eyes of the bank, that box is marital property, and I have every right to access it. We are going to that bank the second they open their doors tomorrow. We spent the rest of the night reviewing the paperwork Nia had salvaged, building a chronological timeline of Preston's financial ruin. By the time the sun began to rise over Chicago, we were running on pure adrenaline and black coffee. We dressed in sharp, tailored business attire. We needed to look like we belonged in a high-tier wealth management firm. We needed to project absolute, unquestionable authority. The drive into the financial district was silent, but charged with an electric, undeniable anticipation. The gray morning sky hung heavy over the skyscrapers, but inside the car, the atmosphere felt like the calm before a devastating storm. I looked over at Nia in the passenger seat. She was staring straight ahead, her jaw set, clutching her leather tote bag. We were two women who had been chronically underestimated by the exact same people, and we were about to dismantle their entire world. We pulled up to the bank just as the heavy glass doors were unlocked for business. The interior was a fortress of polished marble brass fixtures and hushed, wealthy discretion. We marched straight past the plush waiting area and approached the main reception desk. A polished bank manager in a crisp suit looked up from his monitor, offering a polite but guarded smile. "Good morning, ladies. How can I assist you today?" Nia did not miss a single beat. She stepped forward, placing her driver's license, her marriage certificate, and the billing receipt flat on the mahogany counter. Then she set the silver key right on top of the paperwork. "Good morning," Nia said, her tone dripping with corporate authority. "I need to access safe deposit box number 408. The account is under Preston Holdings LLC, but as you can see from the origination receipt, the rental fees are billed directly to my joint marital account. I am the legal spouse and co-owner of the funding account, and I am here to conduct a routine inspection of our assets." The bank manager blinked slightly, taken aback by her commanding presence. He looked at the key, then down at the marriage certificate. He typed the box number into his computer system. I held my breath, my fingernails biting into the palms of my hands. If Preston had set up specific biometric locks or exclusive access clauses, we would be thrown out immediately. "I see the account here, Mrs. Hayes," the manager said slowly, his eyes scanning the screen. "Your husband is listed as the primary key holder. However, because the billing is tied directly to your verified joint account and you possess the physical key, standard protocol allows for spousal access. I will just need to make a photocopy of your identification for the access log." Nia handed over her ID without a flinch. She was completely unflappable. A few minutes later, a security officer escorted us across the lobby and toward the back of the building. The sound of our heels clicking against the marble floor echoed loudly in the quiet space. We approached a massive circular steel vault door that looked like it belonged in a movie. The guard turned a heavy wheel, and the gate swung open with a deep mechanical groan. The air inside the vault was cold and sterile, smelling of old paper and polished metal. The walls were lined from floor to ceiling with hundreds of narrow rectangular metal doors. The guard led us down a narrow aisle and stopped in front of box 408. He inserted a master key into the left lock, then gestured for Nia to insert her silver key into the right. They turned the keys simultaneously. A heavy click echoed through the aisle. The guard pulled the long black metal box out from the cavity and handed it to Nia. "You can take this into private viewing room B," the guard said, pointing to a small enclosed glass room just outside the vault. "Take as much time as you need. Press the call button on the wall when you are ready to secure the box." We thanked him and walked into the viewing room, shutting the heavy glass door behind us. The room was completely soundproof. It was just me, Nia, and the black metal box sitting in the center of a polished wooden table. We stood there for a moment staring at it. This was the epicenter of their lies. This was the vault where my parents and my brother had buried their secrets, fully believing they were untouchable. "Ready?" Nia asked, resting her hands on either side of the lid. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the last 30 years settling firmly on my shoulders. "Open it." Nia flipped the metal latches and lifted the lid. The box was packed to the brim with thick manila folders, bound legal pads, and sealed envelopes. I reached in and pulled out the very first stack of documents, my eyes instantly scanning the bold typed headings. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as the ink came into focus. The missing pieces of my grandmother's estate had not vanished into thin air. They had been carefully criminally engineered, and the proof was sitting right in the palm of my hand. I stared at the heavy parchment paper, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. At the top of the stack, bold letters declared the establishment of the Hayes Family Heritage Trust. I flipped to the second page, then the third, tracing the flow of assets. The documents outlined the exact transfer of my grandmother Beatrice's property, explicitly bypassing probate court and funneling her home directly under the absolute control of Richard and Patricia. But it was the final page that made my stomach turn completely. There, sitting above a notary stamp that I recognized as belonging to one of my father's old golf buddies, was my grandmother's signature. It was a spectacular, glaring forgery. The handwriting was too sharp, too fluid, and entirely too deliberate. My grandmother had suffered from severe arthritis in her final years. She could barely hold a pen to sign a birthday card, let alone execute a flawless, sweeping signature on a complex legal trust document. My parents had not just manipulated the banking system to force a foreclosure. They had committed outright felony forgery to establish their initial claim. Nia leaned over my shoulder, her eyes darting across the pages. As an accountant, she spotted the financial discrepancies instantly. "Look at the dates," she whispered, tapping a manicured fingernail against the bottom margin of the trust agreement. "This trust was supposedly established 3 days after your grandmother was admitted to the memory care facility. She was not even legally competent to sign a contract of this magnitude at that point. Your parents fabricated this entire document, backdated the notary stamp, and buried it in Preston's safe deposit box to ensure it would never be subpoenaed if her actual estate went through public probate." The sheer arrogance of their scheme was breathtaking. They used Preston's hidden bank box as an off-the-books vault for their criminal conspiracy. We had the smoking gun. We had the exact proof Bradley needed to destroy their civil lawsuit and hand them over to federal prosecutors. I began carefully placing the forged documents back into my leather bag, treating them like unexploded ordnances. We needed to get these files to my lawyer immediately. Before I could zip the bag shut, a loud, violent crash echoed from the front of the bank. The heavy oak doors of the lobby swung open so hard they slammed against the marble walls. I peered through the glass partition of the private viewing room and felt my blood run cold. Preston was storming across the polished floor, his face flushed a dangerous mottled red. He was out of breath, his expensive tailored suit jacket flapping open, gripping his cell phone like a weapon. He must have received an automated security alert the moment Nia's key turned in the vault lock, a digital notification warning him of spousal access. His eyes scanned the room wildly before locking onto the glass enclosure. When he saw me standing next to his wife holding the documents that proved his family's criminal empire, he completely lost his mind.
"Nia, you open this door right now!"
Preston screamed, slamming his fist against the reinforced glass. The loud thud reverberated through the quiet, wealthy establishment, drawing shocked gasps from the tellers and the affluent clients standing in the main lobby. He rattled the brass handle violently, but the heavy security door was locked from the inside. "You have absolutely no right to be in there. Those are my private business assets. Give me that box." I shoved the folders deeper into my bag and slung it securely over my shoulder, standing my ground. Nia stood perfectly still beside me, her chin raised. She looked at the man she had married with a cold, disgusted clarity. She did not flinch, she did not apologize, and she did not reach for the door handle. We waited in silence for the bank staff to intervene. Two armed security guards rushed across the lobby, placing their large frames between Preston and our glass enclosure. The bank manager trailed closely behind them, his face pale with alarm. "Sir, you need to step back immediately," the taller guard ordered, placing a firm hand squarely on Preston's chest. "You are disturbing the peace and threatening our clients. If you do not calm down, we will be forced to call the police." Preston shoved the guard's hand away, his eyes wild and unhinged. "Those women are stealing from me," he yelled, pointing a trembling finger at the glass partition. "That is my wife, and she is committing corporate espionage with my deranged sister. Arrest them. They are taking my property." The bank manager stepped forward, maintaining his strict corporate composure. "Mr. Hayes, your wife accessed this box legally, using authorized credentials and the physical key. She is fully within her rights as a verified co-owner of the billing account. You, however, are creating a hostile environment. Escort him out." The manager signaled the guards. As the two men grabbed Preston by the arms and began dragging him backward toward the heavy front doors, his facade of the wealthy, composed entrepreneur completely disintegrated. He thrashed against their grip, his expensive shoes scuffing the pristine marble floor. His face contorted in pure malice, stripping away every ounce of the golden child persona my parents had so carefully cultivated for him. His eyes locked onto mine one last time before the guards shoved him out into the street. The heavy doors began to close, but not before his final vicious threat echoed off the high ceilings of the lobby. "You think you won, Sydney?" he roared, his voice cracking with venom. "I will destroy you. I will make sure you lose your appraiser license. I am going to ruin your career. I will leave you with absolutely nothing." The doors clicked shut, plunging the bank back into a shocked, tense silence. I let out a breath I did not realize I was holding. Preston was unhinged, backed into a corner and entirely desperate. I knew his threat was not just a tantrum. He and my parents had already stolen my identity and sued me for my own home. I knew they would stop at nothing to tear my livelihood apart to protect their secrets. But as I clutched the bag containing their forged legacy, I knew I was finally holding the one thing that could stop them. Nia and I did not waste a single second. The moment the heavy glass doors of the bank clicked shut behind Preston, we walked out of the viewing room, locked the empty metal box back in the vault, and left through the side exit to avoid any lingering drama in the lobby. I drove straight to Bradley's office. I practically threw the leather bag onto his polished conference table. When Bradley saw the forged signature and the backdated notary stamp, his predatory smile returned in full force. He told us he had everything he needed to draft the federal referrals and prepare the civil counterclaims. For the rest of the day, I felt an incredible soaring high. We finally had them cornered. I woke up the following morning feeling lighter than I had in weeks. I put on my favorite navy blazer, grabbed my coffee, and drove to my appraisal firm. I walked into the office ready to tackle my morning reports, but the atmosphere felt distinctly wrong. The usual morning chatter was completely absent. My manager, a strict-by-the-book man named David, was standing by my desk. He did not say good morning. He just asked me to follow him to the Human Resources Department. My stomach did a slow, uncomfortable flip. I followed him down the quiet hallway and walked into the HR suite. The director was sitting behind her desk with a thick, ominous folder resting in front of her. David shut the door behind us with a heavy thud. "They told me to sit down. I was being suspended indefinitely effective immediately." I stared at them in total shock. I asked what was going on. The HR director slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was an anonymous tip, but it was not just a random angry phone call. It was a highly sophisticated, meticulously fabricated dossier. The complaint accused me of insider trading and market manipulation. It claimed I was using my secure professional access to identify vulnerable foreclosure properties, manipulating the appraisal values in the county database to suppress their worth, and then buying them through shell companies for personal profit. I stared at the paper, my blood turning to ice. The complaint specifically referenced the house I had just purchased. They had taken my completely legal public auction purchase and spun it into a massive ethical violation. My parents and Preston had weaponized my own career against me. They knew exactly which buttons to push to trigger an automatic suspension in the highly regulated real estate industry. Richard had the corporate connections to make a fake dossier look incredibly legitimate, and Preston had the malicious drive to execute it. I tried to defend myself. I told David and the HR director that the claims were completely false, that this was a targeted attack by estranged family members involved in a civil dispute. But David shook his head. He told me that because of the severity of the allegations, they had a legal obligation to report the tip to the state licensing board. If the board decided to investigate and found any merit to the fabricated claims, I could lose my appraiser license permanently. I was ordered to hand over my company keycard, my laptop, and my access tokens right then and there. I had to pack up my desk, while 2 security guards stood by my cubicle watching me like I was a common criminal. The humiliation burned hot in my chest. My coworkers, people I had known for years and eaten lunch with every single day, averted their eyes as I was escorted out of the building. Nobody said a word. I stood in the parking lot holding a cardboard box of my personal belongings. The cold morning wind whipped around me, stinging my cheeks. Preston had made good on his threat in less than 24 hours. He and my parents were systematically trying to cut off my livelihood. They knew I had retained a top-tier lawyer. They knew Bradley would be expensive. Their strategy was glaringly obvious. They wanted to drain my finances so I could not afford to fight them in court. They wanted me broke, desperate, and begging for mercy, so I would sign over my grandmother's house just to survive. I tossed my box into the trunk of my car and slammed it shut. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. I was pushed to my absolute limit. They had stolen my identity, ruined my credit, sued me for my own home, and now they had taken the career I spent nearly a decade building. They thought taking away my paycheck would break my spirit. They thought stripping me of my professional dignity would force me into submission. But they had severely miscalculated. Losing my job did not make me want to surrender. It stripped away the last remaining ounce of restraint I had left. I got into the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel, staring blankly at the brick wall of my former office building. They wanted to play dirty. They wanted to destroy my life to protect a 34-year-old man who threw tantrums in bank lobbies. I pulled out my phone and sent a single text message to Nia, letting her know they had struck back. Then I put the car in drive. I was officially done playing defense, and I knew exactly where I needed to go next to confront the man pulling the strings. The drive into downtown Chicago was a blur of gray concrete and brake lights. My father was a senior executive at a massive logistics firm, an arrogant man who operated out of a towering glass high-rise in the financial district. He was someone who believed rules were written exclusively for other people. I bypassed the lavish main lobby and steered my car down the steep, curving ramp into the underground executive parking garage. I knew his daily routine perfectly. Richard never parked in the general lots. He had a reserved premium space on the lowest level, situated right next to the private elevators. The air in the subterranean garage was bitterly cold, thick with the smell of motor oil and damp cement. The flickering fluorescent lights overhead cast long, eerie shadows across the rows of expensive vehicles. I parked my car 2 aisles over from his pristine silver sedan, killed the engine, and waited. The silence was heavy and suffocating. Every few minutes, the distant rumble of the city above vibrated through the concrete pillars, but down here it felt like an isolated concrete tomb. I did not have to wait long. About 20 minutes later, the heavy metal door of the executive elevator slid open with a sharp mechanical chime. My father walked out. He was dressed in a flawless charcoal suit, carrying a leather briefcase projecting the exact image of the untouchable corporate patriarch. He was walking with a brisk, arrogant confidence, a man who had just successfully ruined his daughter's career and was ready to go enjoy a lavish lunch to celebrate. I stepped out of my car and slammed the doors shut. The loud metallic bang echoed violently through the empty parking structure. Richard stopped dead in his tracks. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he spotted me stepping out from the shadows of the concrete pillars. I walked deliberately toward him, my heels clicking sharply against the pavement. I did not stop until I was standing less than 5 feet away, invading his personal space. He did not look surprised to see me. In fact, a slow, condescending smile spread across his face. He set his leather briefcase down on the hood of his car and calmly reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a thick, expensive cigar and a silver lighter. "Did you enjoy your morning at the office, Sydney?" he asked. His voice was smooth and perfectly leveled, echoing slightly in the vast empty garage. I imagine it was a bit more chaotic than usual. I stared at him, feeling a terrifying kind of clarity wash over me. I had spent 30 years trying to earn this man's respect. I had played by every rule, achieved every academic and professional milestone, and begged for a fraction of the pride he so freely handed to my deceitful brother. Standing there in the dim light, watching him casually prep his cigar, I realized how entirely foolish I had been. He was not a father. He was a predator in a tailored suit. "You framed me," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low. "You filed a fabricated anonymous tip to my human resources department. You accused me of market manipulation to trigger an automatic suspension with the state licensing board. You are actively trying to destroy the license I spent 8 years earning." Richard struck the silver lighter. The small, bright flame illuminated his cold eyes. He held it to the tip of his cigar, took a slow, deliberate draw, and blew a thick cloud of acrid smoke into the cold air between us. "I did what was necessary," he said casually, as if we were discussing the weather. "You chose to start a war over a piece of property that you knew belonged to your brother. You humiliated your mother and me in front of Preston's colleagues at that restaurant. You thought you could disrespect this family and simply walk away to your little independent life without facing any repercussions. You were sorely mistaken." He took another drag of his cigar, his posture entirely relaxed. "You left me no choice, Sydney. We needed to remind you exactly who holds the power in this dynamic. If you want to play real estate mogul and steal assets from your own blood, you need to understand that actions have consequences." "You are calling me a thief," I shot back, my voice dripping with absolute disgust. "You and Patricia deliberately let my grandmother's home slide into foreclosure. You manufactured a fake bankruptcy to rob me of my inheritance, and then you used my social security number to saddle me with $500,000 in commercial debt so Preston could play pretend businessman. Do not you dare stand there and lecture me about actions having consequences." Richard did not flinch. The mention of the stolen identity and the foreclosure fraud did not rattle him in the slightest. He looked at me with the detached, analytical gaze of a corporate raider assessing a hostile takeover. "You brought this entirely on yourself," he said coldly. "Preston is building an empire. He needs capital, and he needs a pristine credit profile to secure his investments. You are sitting on excellent credit and doing absolutely nothing of value with it. Families support each other, Sydney. If you had just willingly contributed to your brother's success, none of this unpleasantness would have been required. But since you decided to be selfish, we took what was needed." I felt a sickening jolt in my stomach. He genuinely believed his own twisted logic. He truly believed that stealing my identity and ruining my career were perfectly justified actions to ensure Preston's success. He viewed me as nothing more than a disposable resource, a collateral casualty in the ongoing project of propping up his golden child. "And as for your little job suspension," Richard continued, stepping closer so I could smell the sharp, bitter scent of the tobacco clinging to his clothes. "Consider it a hard lesson in loyalty. Destroying your livelihood is simply the cost of crossing blood." He picked his leather briefcase up off the hood of the car. He looked me up and down, his expression radiating pure, unadulterated contempt. "You have absolutely no money to fight us now, Sydney. You have no job, your credit is completely ruined, and our civil lawsuit is going to bury you in legal fees until you are bankrupt. So here is what is going to happen. You are going to sign the deed of that house over to Preston by Friday afternoon. You are going to drop this ridiculous rebellion and apologize to your mother. If you do exactly as you are told, I might make a phone call and have that anonymous HR complaint retracted so you can beg for your pathetic little job back. If you refuse, I will personally ensure you never work in real estate in the state of Illinois ever again." Richard turned around, opened the door of his luxury sedan, and slid into the driver's seat. He did not look back at me. He started the engine, the powerful motor roaring to life in the concrete cavern. He put the car in drive and pulled smoothly out of the parking space, leaving me standing alone in the cloud of his exhaust fumes. I watched his taillights disappear up the ramp and out into the city streets. He drove away completely confident that he had won. He was absolutely certain that he had broken my spirit, severed my resources, and forced me into a corner from which I could never escape. But as I stood there in the freezing, echoing parking garage, I did not feel broken. I felt a cold, sharp, and terrifyingly clear sense of purpose. Richard thought he had disarmed me. He had no idea that his arrogant confession was exactly the fuel I needed to burn his world to ashes. I turned around and walked back to my car. I had a house to tear apart and a legacy to reclaim. The drive from the financial district back to my neighborhood was a blur of rain and adrenaline. I gripped the steering wheel, replaying Richard's cold, calculated threats in my mind. He believed that cornering me financially would paralyze me. He thought that stripping away my corporate career would leave me helpless and desperate. But he fundamentally misunderstood who I was. He spent his days in glass towers moving invisible money, while I spent my career walking through abandoned, ruined properties, finding the hidden value beneath the surface. He was right about one thing: the gloves were officially off. I parked in my driveway and dashed through the freezing rain into the house. The interior was freezing, the air thick with the smell of old wood and neglect. I did not turn on the main heating grid. The biting cold was exactly the sharp reality check I needed. I walked straight past the stack of moving boxes in the hallway and went into the master bedroom. I stripped off my tailored navy blazer and silk blouse, tossing the uniform of the career my father had just sabotaged onto the floor. I pulled on heavy denim work pants, a thick canvas shirt, and laced up my steel-toed boots. I marched out to the attached garage and grabbed a sledgehammer, a heavy steel crowbar, and a pair of thick leather work gloves. I walked into the center of the dilapidated living room. The wall separating the main seating area from the kitchen was a total disaster. It was covered in peeling wallpaper and blooming patches of black mold, the direct result of a roof leak my parents had intentionally ignored while letting the property slide into foreclosure. But beneath that decaying drywall was the original brick masonry my grandmother Beatrice had meticulously maintained for decades. She used to sit in this exact room, reading by the fireplace, keeping her sharp eyes on everything. I lifted the sledgehammer, feeling the heavy, solid weight of the iron head. I swung it directly into the center of the rotting plaster. The wall caved inward with a violent, satisfying crunch. A thick cloud of chalky white dust exploded into the freezing air. I swung again, driving the iron through the wooden studs. I pictured Preston sitting in that private dining room sipping $200 wine bought with my stolen credit. I swung the hammer. I pictured my mother standing in my foyer lying straight to my face about a family trust. I swung again. I pictured Richard standing in that underground garage coldly admitting he was destroying my livelihood just to protect his golden child. For 2 straight hours, I tore the room apart. I stripped away the rot my family had allowed to fester, ripping the wall down to its literal skeleton. Sweat dripped down my face, stinging my eyes, and mixing with the heavy plaster dust coating my skin. My arms ached, but the physical exhaustion was the ultimate release for the boiling rage inside my chest. I tossed the ruined slabs of drywall into a massive pile behind me, finally exposing the original red brickwork of the grand fireplace hearth. As I used my crowbar to clear away the debris near the base of the chimney, the steel edge struck the brick with an unusual hollow thud. I paused, wiping my forehead with the back of my canvas sleeve. I dropped to my knees on the dust-covered floorboards and examined the lower right corner of the masonry. To a casual observer, the wall looked perfectly normal, but my appraiser training kicked in immediately. The mortar sealing a cluster of 4 bricks near the floorboard was entirely different from the rest of the hearth. It was not the original century-old cement. It was a sloppy amateur patch job, a slightly lighter shade of gray attempting to blend in with the surrounding architecture. I ran my gloved fingers over the rough, uneven edges. I wedged the flat chisel end of my crowbar directly into the crumbling mortar line and applied all my body weight. The dry, aged cement cracked and flaked away instantly, confirming it had not been set properly. I pushed harder, wiggling the heavy steel tool deep into the crevice. With a sharp, aggressive twist of my wrist, the center brick broke completely free from the wall. I grabbed the exposed edges of the brick and pulled it outward. It was unnervingly light. As it slid free from the masonry, the awkward weight distribution caused it to slip from my grip. It plummeted to the hardwood floor and shattered on impact, splitting cleanly down the middle. The brick was completely hollowed out. I stared at the dark rectangular cavity left behind in the foundation. My heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. I pulled off my leather work glove and reached my bare hand into the cold, dark recess of the wall. My fingertips brushed against something wrapped tightly in thick plastic. I closed my hand around the object and carefully pulled it out into the dim light of the living room. It was a small, heavy rectangular bundle bound securely in layers of yellowed packing tape and coated in a thick layer of undisturbed dust. I sat back on my heels, my breathing shallow and fast in the quiet, empty house. I grabbed a utility knife from my tool belt and carefully sliced through the brittle tape, peeling the protective layers back one by one. Inside the wrapping lay a vintage heavy-duty microcassette tape recorder. It was a model from the late 90s, bulky and constructed of solid black plastic. The device was pristine, perfectly preserved within its makeshift tomb inside the wall. Sitting right next to it in the plastic wrapping was a small, unopened package of batteries. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. My grandmother had hidden this. Beatrice had deliberately hollowed out a brick in her own home, sealed this device in plastic to protect it from moisture, and cemented it into the foundation. She had created a secret time capsule, a hidden vault that my parents had completely overlooked when they orchestrated their financial laundering scheme. Richard and Patricia had been so relentlessly focused on manipulating the bank and seizing the deed that they never bothered to actually inspect the bones of the property they were stealing. I held the cold plastic recorder in my hands, tracing the smooth buttons with my thumb. The weight of the discovery settled over me. My grandmother had known exactly who my parents were. She had known exactly what they were capable of, and she had taken extreme, desperate measures to leave something behind. I looked down at the small cassette tape already loaded behind the clear plastic door of the device, knowing instantly that whatever was recorded on that magnetic ribbon was the key to destroying my family's entire empire. I tore the stiff cardboard backing off the battery package, my hands shaking so badly I dropped one of the AA cylinders onto the dusty floorboards. I scrambled to retrieve it, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I popped the battery door off the back of the heavy plastic recorder, slid the power cells into place, and snapped the cover shut. I took a deep breath, staring at the small play button. Pressing it felt like crossing a threshold from which I could never return. I pushed the button down. A loud mechanical click echoed in the empty living room, followed by a thick layer of static hissing from the small built-in speaker. I held the device close to my ear, straining to listen. Then a voice broke through the white noise. "Sydney, if you are hearing this, it means they finally did it." My breath caught in my throat. It was my grandmother. Her voice was frail, wavering with age and exhaustion, but the sharp, undeniable clarity of her mind was fully intact. Tears immediately blurred my vision. I had not heard her voice in 4 years. "I do not have much time," Beatrice continued on the recording, her words punctuated by heavy, labored breathing. "Richard and Patricia are moving me to a locked memory care unit by the end of the week. They have bribed a doctor to declare me legally incompetent. They took my phone and my car keys. They think I'm losing my mind, but I hear everything. I know exactly what they are planning to do to you, my sweet girl. I am hiding this recorder in the hearth because I know you will find it. You always were the only one in this family who actually paid attention to the foundation of things. Listen to what I caught them saying yesterday. Take this to a lawyer, Sydney. Burn them to the ground. There was a loud shuffling sound on the tape, followed by a harsh metallic clatter, as if the recorder had been shoved hastily under a piece of furniture or dropped inside an air vent. The static hummed for a few seconds before the distinct muffled sound of a door opening leaked through the speaker. Then I heard my father. Richard's voice was unmistakable. It dripped with that same arrogant, commanding tone he used in the parking garage. "We have the medical proxy signed," Richard said on the tape. "They are transferring the old bat to the facility on Friday. As soon as she is locked in the ward, we stop paying the property taxes entirely." I gripped the tape recorder so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Are you absolutely sure the bank will not contact Sydney?" Patricia asked. Her voice was cold, completely devoid of any remorse for locking her own mother-in-law in a facility. "If it goes to foreclosure, the county sends out notices to next of kin." "Let them send notices," Richard scoffed. "By the time the bank legally seizes it, the title is washed. Sydney will just assume the estate was bankrupt. She is too busy measuring square footage for other people to track our assets. Once the bank lists it for a closed auction, I will have my contacts at the firm secure the deed directly for Preston." Then came Preston's voice. He sounded whiny, agitated, and incredibly desperate. "How are you going to secure a mortgage for me when my credit is completely underwater?" Preston complained. "I cannot even get approved for a basic business credit card right now. My LLC is bleeding cash, Dad. I need liquidity, not just a house." There was a brief pause on the tape. Then my mother spoke, her tone chillingly casual. "You are going to use your sister's social security number," Patricia said. I gasped aloud in the empty room. Hearing her say it, hearing my own mother effortlessly suggest identity theft, as if she were offering him a cup of coffee, made me physically nauseous. I pulled Sydney's original birth certificate and social security card from the safe this morning. Patricia continued smoothly on the recording. "Her credit score is pristine. She has zero debt. We will use her credentials to secure commercial funding for your LLC. You can pull $500,000 by the end of the month to float your businesses. As long as you make the minimum payments, Sydney will never even know the loans exist. She is too naive to run a deep-dive credit report on herself. But what if she finds out?" Preston asked, a hint of cowardice edging into his voice. "That is federal fraud, Mom. If she reports it, I go to prison." "She will not report it," Richard snapped aggressively. "She is terrified of causing a scene. She has spent her entire life begging for our approval. If she ever finds out, we will just threaten to cut her out of the family completely. She will fold. She always folds. Now shut up, take the social security card and go apply for the commercial loans before the bank closes today. I will handle forging your grandmother's signature on the fake trust documents tonight." The tape clicked and the audio went dead. I sat on the dusty floorboards of my living room, completely paralyzed. The recording was not just a piece of evidence. It was a flawless, undeniable confession. They had outlined every single step of their criminal enterprise with terrifying precision. They admitted to kidnapping my grandmother via a fraudulent medical proxy. They admitted to the deliberate foreclosure scheme. They explicitly conspired to commit felony identity theft, and my father openly confessed to planning the forgery of the trust documents. It was the ultimate smoking gun. It was the nuclear launch codes. I did not waste a single second processing the emotional devastation of hearing my parents speak about me like I was livestock. I shoved the microcassette recorder into my heavy canvas work bag. I did not even bother changing out of my dust-covered clothes or steel-toed boots. I sprinted out to my car, threw the car into reverse, and sped out of my driveway. I drove directly to the financial district, completely ignoring the speed limit. I pulled up to Bradley's towering glass office building and tossed my keys to the shocked valet, leaving a trail of white plaster dust on the polished marble floors of the lobby as I marched toward the elevators. I burst through the heavy glass doors of the law firm. The receptionist opened her mouth to ask if I had an appointment, but I walked right past her desk, heading straight for Bradley's corner office. I pushed his door open. Bradley was sitting at his desk, reviewing a stack of legal briefs. He looked up, taking in my disheveled, dust-covered appearance with a raised eyebrow. I walked over to his desk, unzipped my canvas bag, and placed the vintage black tape recorder right on top of his pristine legal documents. I hit the play button. Bradley leaned back in his leather chair and listened. He did not say a word as my grandmother's desperate plea filled the quiet office. He remained perfectly still as my father, my mother, and Preston explicitly detailed their entire criminal conspiracy. When the tape finally clicked off, the silence in the room was deafening. Bradley stared at the tape recorder for a long, heavy moment. Then he looked up at me. His eyes were wide, shining with a dangerous, unrestrained thrill. Sidney Bradley said, his voice dropping to a low, predatory whisper. "Do you have any idea what you just handed me?" I nodded, brushing a streak of plaster dust off my cheek. "I handed you the keys to their prison cells." Bradley let out a sharp, genuine laugh. He grabbed his desk phone and immediately dialed his paralegal. "Cancel everything else on my schedule for the rest of the week," he ordered, his eyes never leaving mine. "Draft a formal evidence submission to the opposing counsel and prepare the exhibits for the upcoming depositions." He hung up the phone and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "They are going to walk into the pre-trial deposition thinking they have you completely cornered," Bradley said, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "Preston is going to sit under oath and lie through his teeth, and we are going to let him dig his grave 10 feet deep before we drop this tape on the table. We are not just winning your house back, Sidney. We are going to bury them." I sat down in the leather chair opposite him, feeling the exhaustion finally catch up to my adrenaline. But beneath the fatigue there was a burning, unstoppable fire. My family thought I would fold. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. The pre-trial deposition took place 3 weeks later in a sterile, windowless conference room at the opposing counsel's law firm. The air conditioning was cranked so high it felt like a meat locker, but I was sweating underneath my tailored blazer. I sat perfectly still next to Bradley, watching the court reporter set up her stenography machine. The heavy oak door swung open and Preston walked in. He looked like a walking caricature of wealth, wearing a bespoke navy suit, a silk tie, and a flashy gold watch he definitely could not afford. He carried himself with an infuriating, untouchable swagger. He did not look like a man facing a massive civil lawsuit or potential federal fraud charges. He looked like a guy arriving at a country club brunch. He took his seat across the long mahogany table, flashing me a patronizing, toothy smirk, before leaning back and crossing his arms. His lawyer, a frantic, red-faced man who looked entirely out of his depth, sat down beside him and began shuffling through a stack of manila folders. Bradley did not bother with pleasantries. The moment the court reporter signaled she was on the record, he launched his assault. His voice was smooth, conversational, but laced with a lethal precision. He started with the basics, establishing Preston's identity and his role as the sole proprietor of Preston Holdings, LLC. Preston answered the preliminary questions with bored arrogance. He practically rolled his eyes when Bradley asked him to state his primary sources of income. "I am an entrepreneur," Preston stated, adjusting his cuffs. "I manage a diverse portfolio of highly successful real estate investments and private equity ventures." I kept my face completely blank, but inside my blood was boiling. I knew for a fact his business accounts were overdrawn by tens of thousands of dollars. I knew it because Nia had provided me with the exact routing numbers and negative balance statements. Nia was the ultimate ghost in our machine. While Preston sat there spinning his web of lies, he had absolutely no idea that his own wife had already handed us the blueprints to his financial ruin. "Let us talk about the funding for these highly successful ventures," Bradley said casually, flipping open a blank notepad. "Can you tell me how you secure capital for Preston Holdings, LLC? I rely on private investors and standard commercial lending," Preston answered smoothly. "I have a very strong relationship with several regional banks." Bradley did not miss a beat. Have you ever utilized your sister's social security number to secure a commercial line of credit? Preston scoffed, letting out a harsh, mocking laugh. Absolutely not. That is a ridiculous accusation. Sydney does not have the kind of financial leverage I need for my operations. I would never touch her credit. Perjury. He lied under oath without a single flinch. The court reporter's fingers flew across her machine forever, immortalizing his felony on the official legal record. I glanced at Bradley. He did not react. He just nodded slowly, giving Preston enough rope to hang himself. Let us move on to this Beatrice Hayes estate. Bradley continued, shifting his line of questioning seamlessly. Were you aware that your grandmother's property was intentionally allowed to enter foreclosure status? Preston sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. It was a tragedy. My grandmother was terribly sick. Her medical bills piled up, and she hid her financial struggles from the family until it was too late. By the time my parents found out, the bank had already initiated the seizure. We had no choice but to let it go. Perjury number 2. He was spinning the exact narrative my parents had rehearsed, completely unaware that we possessed the tape recording of Richard and Patricia actively planning to stop paying the property taxes the very week they locked her in a memory care unit. And the family trust? Bradley asked, leaning forward slightly. The trust that bypasses probate court and grants your parents total authority over the property. Were you involved in drafting those documents? I am not a lawyer. Preston deflected, keeping his chin high. But my grandmother established that trust to ensure her legacy was protected from greedy, estranged relatives. She wanted her assets managed by people she trusted. She signed those papers in front of a notary of her own free will. Perjury number 3. Bradley spent the next 2 hours surgically dismantling Preston's timeline. He asked highly specific, pointed questions about Preston's whereabouts on the dates the loans were originated. He asked about a specific safe deposit box at a downtown wealth management bank. Preston categorically denied having any off-the-books storage boxes. He denied draining his joint marital savings account. He denied having any knowledge of the forged notary stamp. Every single answer was a verifiable, documented lie. Every syllable that left his mouth contradicted the mountain of physical evidence Nia had pulled from his home safe and the bank vault. Preston was so blinded by his own narcissism, so convinced of his intellectual superiority, that he could not see the massive steel trap snapping shut around his ankles. He thought Bradley was just fishing for information. He thought I had showed up to the deposition empty-handed, hoping to squeeze a settlement out of him. When the deposition finally concluded, Preston stood up and buttoned his jacket. He looked across the table at me, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. This was a monumental waste of my time, Sydney. Preston sneered, leaning over the mahogany table. You have absolutely nothing. You are going to lose that house, and you are going to be paying my legal fees for the next decade. I looked up at him, keeping my expression perfectly composed. I did not say a word. I just let him walk out of the room feeling like the smartest man in the world. He had no idea that his entire life was about to implode. But as I packed up my briefcase and followed Bradley out into the bustling city streets, the cold reality of my family's desperation began to set in. Preston was a cornered animal, and cornered animals did not just lie. They lashed out. And I was about to find out exactly how violent my brother could be when he realized his words were not enough to stop me. The evening following the deposition felt entirely different from the days leading up to it. The initial rush of securing the hidden tape recorder and launching our legal counteroffensive had carried me through the week on pure adrenaline. But after sitting across from Preston, watching him casually perjure himself with that arrogant, untouchable smirk, the reality of my situation settled deep into my bones. He was not just a spoiled, entitled brother trying to get his way. He was a desperate man watching his fabricated empire slowly begin to crack, even if he did not yet realize I held the hammer. I drove back to my foreclosed house under the cover of a starless ink-black sky. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of deep suburban silence that usually brought me peace. Tonight, however, the stillness felt oppressive. I pulled into my driveway, staring up at the dark windows of the property. It was mine. I had bought it legally, uncovered its hidden history, and ripped open the walls to find my grandmother's truth. Yet as I walked up the front steps and unlocked the door, I felt an unshakable sense of vulnerability. I walked through the house, double-checking every single lock. I checked the deadbolt on the front door, secured the sliding glass door in the kitchen, and made sure every first-floor window was latched tight. The house was still a construction zone. The living room wall I had demolished remained exposed, the original red brick hearth standing like a monument amidst the drywall dust and bare wooden studs. I grabbed a quick shower to wash off the sterile chill of the law firm, put on thick sweatpants and a heavy hooded sweatshirt, and collapsed onto my mattress. I lay in the dark, staring up at the ceiling. My mind was racing, cataloging every lie Preston had told under oath, anticipating Bradley's next legal maneuver, and worrying about Nia navigating the fallout on her end. Exhaustion eventually dragged me under, pulling me into a heavy, dreamless sleep. I do not know exactly what time it was when the silence of the house was violently shattered. It sounded like a bomb going off inside my living room. An explosive, deafening crash of shattering glass echoed through the empty hallways, followed by the heavy, brutal thud of a solid object hitting the hardwood floor. I shot up in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs with such force it knocked the breath completely out of my lungs. My entire body went rigid. I sat in the pitch-black bedroom, straining to listen over the rushing sound of blood in my ears. The house was entirely silent again, except for a new, chilling sound. I could hear the harsh, freezing wind howling through a massive, jagged opening in the front of my home. Someone had just smashed my window. Panic surged through me, cold and sharp, but my survival instincts immediately overrode the fear. I did not turn on the bedside lamp. I did not want to make myself a target by illuminating my location. I slid silently out of bed, my bare feet hitting the cold floorboards. I crept out of my bedroom and moved silently down the dark hallway, heading straight for the attached garage door. I reached into the darkness and wrapped my fingers around the cold, heavy steel crowbar I had used to tear down the living room wall earlier that week. Armed with the heavy iron tool, I pressed my back against the hallway wall and inched my way toward the front of the house. The temperature dropped significantly with every step I took. Freezing night air was pouring into the living room, carrying the faint smell of wet asphalt and dead leaves. I rounded the corner and peered into the living room. The large, picturesque front window was completely obliterated. Jagged, glittering shards of glass were scattered like ice across the hardwood floor, reflecting the pale, eerie light of the street lamps outside. The heavy winter curtains were torn and blowing wildly in the wind. I gripped the crowbar tighter, scanning the shadows of the room, ready to swing at anyone who had breached the property. But the room was empty. There was no intruder standing in the dark. Whoever had done this had struck from the street and fled into the night. I lowered the crowbar slightly and stepped fully into the living room, the broken glass crunching loudly beneath my boots. I reached out and flicked on the overhead light switch. The sudden brightness illuminated the sheer scale of the destruction. The window frame was splintered and thousands of tiny razor-sharp fragments covered the floor, the sofa, and the coffee table. Right in the center of the wreckage, resting heavily on my scarred hardwood floor, was a massive, jagged landscaping brick. It was a dark, heavy stone, the kind you would find bordering a high-end suburban driveway. I approached it slowly, my chest tight with a sickening realization. This was not a random act of vandalism. This was not some neighborhood kids pulling a prank. This was a targeted, calculated act of extreme violence. As I stepped closer to the brick, I noticed something pale secured to its rough surface. Wrapped tightly around the center of the heavy stone, bound by layers of clear packing tape, was a folded piece of white printer paper. I set the crowbar down on the coffee table, my hands trembling violently. I knelt on the floor, ignoring the shards of glass biting into the knees of my sweatpants, and carefully peeled the tape away from the stone. I unfolded the crisp white paper and smoothed it out under the harsh glare of the living room light. The message was typed in a plain, bold font. There were no handwritten clues, no signature, and no return address. Just 3 terrifying, explicit sentences. You have until Friday afternoon to drop the lawsuit and sign the deed transfer over to Preston. If you do not walk away and surrender the property by the end of the week, this brick will not be aimed at your window next time. Sign the papers or face severe physical consequences. I stared at the typed words, the stark black ink burning into my retinas. The threat was not veiled. It was not a subtle passive-aggressive corporate maneuver like the human resources sabotage. This was a direct, unfiltered promise of physical violence. They were explicitly telling me that they were willing to cross the line from financial ruin to bodily harm. My father had sat in that underground parking garage and told me that destroying my career was simply the cost of crossing blood. But this was an entirely different level of depravity. Preston and my parents were watching their fraudulent empire begin to destabilize. The deposition had spooked them. Even though Preston thought he had performed flawlessly, the sheer pressure of being questioned under oath by a litigator like Bradley had clearly triggered a massive panic behind closed doors. They felt their control slipping, and their immediate response was to terrorize me into submission. They wanted me to feel utterly unsafe in the very home I had purchased. They wanted me to look at the shattered glass and the heavy stone and believe that my life was genuinely in danger if I did not bow down to their golden child. I stood up slowly, clutching the threatening note in my hand. The freezing wind whipped through the broken window, chilling my skin, but the cold could not touch the absolute inferno raging inside my chest. I looked down at the brick on my living room floor, then out into the dark, empty street. They thought throwing a rock through my window would make me pack my bags and run. They thought the threat of physical violence would finally break the daughter they had spent a lifetime trying to crush. They had absolutely no idea that this single violent act was the ultimate confirmation of their profound weakness. I was not going to sign a single piece of paper. I was not going to drop the lawsuit. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket, my thumb hovering over the keypad. It was time to call the police, and it was time to bring Nia into the fortress. I dialed 911 and requested immediate police assistance. The dispatcher heard the urgency in my voice and promised officers were on the way. I then dialed Nia. She answered on the second ring, her voice thick with sleep. I did not sugarcoat a single detail. I told her about the shattered glass, the heavy landscaping stone, and the typed note threatening my life if I did not sign the house over to her husband. There was a long, chilling silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the sound of Nia breathing. Then I heard the rustle of bedsheets and the distinct click of a deadbolt locking on a bedroom door. Preston is not just a financial fraud, Nia said, her voice dropping to a harsh, trembling whisper. He is completely unhinged. He left the house hours ago and has not come back. If he and your parents are willing to orchestrate physical violence against their own blood over a real estate dispute, I am not safe in this house anymore. I am packing my bags right now. I am leaving him. Get out of there, I told her firmly. Come straight to my house. Do not tell him where you are going. 10 minutes later, 2 patrol cruisers pulled into my driveway, their red and blue lights flashing against the wet asphalt. 2 uniformed officers stepped onto my porch, their boots crunching on the shattered glass. I led them into the living room and pointed to the heavy brick and the typed note resting on my coffee table. I explained the entire situation, detailing the hostile civil lawsuit my parents had filed and the immediate suspicious suspension from my corporate job. The officers did not treat the incident as a random act of teenage vandalism. They recognized the severity of the situation immediately. The older officer pulled on a pair of blue latex gloves and carefully placed the brick and the threatening note into transparent evidence bags. He explained that this was no longer a simple property damage report. The explicit demand for me to sign over a legal deed under threat of physical harm elevated the crime to targeted extortion and criminal intimidation. They took photographs of the destroyed window frame, recorded my official statement, and assured me that detectives would be assigned to the case by morning. Just as the police cruisers were pulling away from my curb, an SUV sped down the dark street and swerved into my driveway. The headlights cut off and Nia stepped out into the freezing wind. She was dragging 2 heavy suitcases and carrying her bulky leather work tote. I rushed outside to help her carry her belongings up the front steps. We hauled her bags inside and slammed the heavy front door shut, throwing the deadbolt and sliding the chain lock into place. Nia stood in my entryway, staring at the massive gaping hole in my living room window. The icy wind continued to blow through the shattered frame, but neither of us shivered. I taped a heavy plastic tarp over the broken window while Nia started boiling water for tea in my kitchen. We sat at the kitchen island, the exact spot where we had formed our alliance just days earlier. But the atmosphere had shifted entirely. We were no longer just compiling financial documents to win a civil dispute. We were barricading ourselves inside a damaged house because the men we were fighting had proven they were dangerous. Preston texted me 3 times while I was packing, Nia said, wrapping her hands around her warm mug. He said he was staying at a hotel downtown because he needed space to deal with the stress of the lawsuit. He was establishing an alibi. He wanted it on the record that he was nowhere near your neighborhood tonight. He is a coward, I said, staring at the plastic tarp flapping in the wind. He throws rocks through windows in the dead of night and hides behind his parents' wealth. But throwing that brick was the biggest mistake he could have possibly made. It proves they are terrified. They know we have them backed into a corner, and they are panicking. Nia nodded, her dark eyes flashing with an unwavering, fierce determination. I left my wedding ring on his desk, she said, her voice steady and resolute. I took every remaining financial document, my passport, and my dignity. I am officially done with that man and his toxic family. I am moving into your guest room, Sydney. We are going to watch each other's backs, and we are not leaving this house unless we are walking into a courtroom to destroy them. I looked across the kitchen island at my sister-in-law. My parents and Preston had spent their entire lives trying to isolate and diminish us. They wanted us to feel small, unsupported, and entirely dependent on their approval. But their relentless cruelty had achieved the exact opposite. By pushing us to the brink, they had inadvertently forged an unbreakable bond between the 2 women they had underestimated the most. We spent the next hour dragging heavy pieces of furniture in front of the ground floor windows and securing every possible entry point. We were fortifying the perimeter, transforming my damaged foreclosure property into an impenetrable fortress. The wind continued to howl outside, rattling the temporary plastic barrier in the living room, but the fear I had felt waking up to shattering glass was completely gone. Preston and my parents had wanted a war. They had escalated from financial theft to physical threats, fully believing they could intimidate us into surrendering our rights and our safety. But as Nia and I sat in the dim light of my kitchen, surrounded by boxes of evidence and locked doors, we were not acting like victims. We were 2 heavily armed professionals preparing for the final devastating battle, and we were absolutely ready to strike back. The harsh morning daylight filtered through the thick plastic tarp taped across my ruined living room window, casting a dull, hazy glow over the wreckage. Neither Nia nor I had slept a single minute. We had spent the remaining hours of the night transforming my kitchen island into a fortified war room. Stacks of bank statements, printouts of the forged trust documents, and the heavy plastic tape recorder were arranged in meticulous chronological order across the marble countertop. At exactly 8 in the morning, a sleek black town car pulled into my driveway. Bradley stepped out carrying his signature leather briefcase. He stopped on the front walkway, his sharp eyes locking onto the shattered glass glittering in the front yard and the heavy plastic flapping in the winter wind. I unlocked the deadbolt and let him inside. He did not offer a polite greeting. He walked straight into the living room, inspected the point of impact, and then looked at the business card the police officer had left on the coffee table. "They threw a brick through your window," Bradley said, his voice stripped of its usual smooth courtroom polish, replaced by a cold, dangerous edge. With a typed note threatening physical violence if I do not drop the lawsuit and sign over the deed, I confirmed, handing him a photocopy of the threat the police had allowed me to make before taking the original into evidence. Bradley read the note. A slow, terrifying smile crept across his face. "They just handed us the final nail for their coffins. This elevates everything from a standard civil dispute to federal witness intimidation." He walked into the kitchen and dropped his briefcase onto the island. Nia stood across from him, her posture rigid, her dark eyes sharp and focused. I introduced them quickly, explaining how Nia had emptied Preston's safe and legally accessed the safe deposit box. Bradley listened intently, his respect for Nia instantly apparent, as she began laying out the financial timeline. Preston's business entities are entirely fraudulent, Nia explained, her tone possessing the lethal precision of a seasoned forensic accountant. He generated fake revenue reports to secure the initial lines of credit using Sydney's social security number. I tracked the routing numbers. The funds from those commercial loans did not go toward any actual business operations. He funneled the cash directly into shell accounts controlled by Richard and Patricia. They used Sydney's stolen identity to launder money right back into their own pockets. Bradley pulled a pen from his jacket pocket, making rapid notes on his legal pad. And the legal fees for the lawsuit against Sydney. Paid for by emptying our joint marital savings account, Nia said, sliding the zero-balance statement across the marble. He stole my money to pay you to fight his sister. I stepped forward and pointed to the forged trust documents we had pulled from the bank vault. And this is how they planned to secure the house. They completely bypassed probate court by forging my grandmother's signature on this trust transfer. Richard and Patricia granted themselves total authority over the estate while she was locked in a memory care unit. Bradley set his pen down. He looked at the mountain of paper, then at the tape recorder, and finally at Nia and me. The atmosphere in the kitchen suddenly shifted, growing incredibly heavy. The pieces of the puzzle had finally locked together to form a picture far darker than a simple real estate dispute. You two need to understand exactly what we are looking at here, Bradley said, leaning his hands flat against the kitchen island. I originally took this case to defend your property rights and countersue for malicious prosecution. That was a civil matter. It meant financial damages. It meant making them pay you back. But what you have uncovered over the last 48 hours is an entirely different beast. He pointed to the bank statements. Securing commercial loans using a stolen identity across state banking lines is federal wire fraud. He pointed to my credit report. Using your credentials without authorization is aggravated identity theft. He pointed to the deposition transcript sitting in his briefcase. Preston sitting across from me yesterday and lying under oath about his finances and the forged documents is felony perjury. Bradley stood up straight, meeting my gaze with absolute, unyielding intensity. If Richard, Patricia, and Preston lose this civil lawsuit, this evidence does not just stay in a county courthouse. I am legally obligated to hand this entire mountain of documentation directly over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The threshold for federal prosecution has been crossed a dozen times over. The reality of his words hit me like a physical shockwave. I looked over at Nia. She was perfectly still, her sharp mind processing the sheer magnitude of the legal trap our family had walked themselves into. They are not fighting for a house anymore, I whispered, the terrifying truth finally clicking into place. Exactly, Bradley confirmed, his voice deadly serious. They threw that brick through your window last night because they are completely terrified. They thought they could bully you into compliance. But my deposition questions spooked them. They realized that the discovery phase of this civil trial is going to expose their entire criminal syndicate. They are fighting for their freedom, Sydney. They are trying to terrorize you into dropping the case because if you push forward, they are all going to a federal penitentiary. The silence that followed was deafening. My parents were not just arrogant, greedy people trying to spoil their golden child. They were cornered criminals staring down decades behind bars. They were willing to shatter my windows, threaten my life, and destroy my career because I was the only thing standing between them and a prison cell. Nia reached out and placed her hand firmly over mine on the kitchen counter. We are not dropping the lawsuit, she said, her voice completely devoid of fear. Let them panic. Let them throw rocks. We have the tape. We have the bank records. We have the forgery. Bradley closed his legal pad and slid it into his briefcase. He looked at both of us, his expression radiating pure, unfiltered confidence. Lock your doors and do not answer any phone calls, Bradley instructed. I am filing the evidence motions this afternoon. By tonight, their lawyers will know exactly what we have and the real panic will set in. We are going to bleed them dry. As Bradley walked out of the house, Nia and I stood shoulder to shoulder in the kitchen. We were barricaded inside a freezing, damaged house, but we had never been more powerful. The endgame had officially begun. The afternoon bled into evening, casting long, distorted shadows across the dust-covered floorboards of my ruined living room. The heavy plastic tarp we had taped over the shattered window whipped frantically against the bitter Chicago wind, serving as a constant abrasive reminder of the violence lurking just outside our walls. Nia and I sat at the kitchen island, nursing lukewarm mugs of tea. The sheer adrenaline that had fueled our morning strategy session with Bradley was slowly giving way to a tense, suffocating waiting game. Bradley had promised to file the evidence motions before the courts closed at 5. We knew that the moment the opposing counsel received the docket updates containing the bank records and the mention of the audio tape, all hell was going to break loose inside my parents' home. We did not have to wait long. At exactly 6:45, my cell phone resting face up on the marble countertop erupted with a harsh, jarring ringtone. The bright screen illuminated the dark kitchen. The caller ID displayed a name I had not expected to see quite so soon. It was Patricia. My mother was calling me directly. I stared at the glowing screen, my pulse instantly accelerating. The strict instructions Bradley had given us echoed loudly in my mind. Lock your doors and do not answer any phone calls. Naya reached across the island and placed her hand over mine, her dark eyes locking onto my face with absolute, unwavering resolve. We let the phone ring. It buzzed aggressively against the marble, vibrating with a desperate, angry energy until the automated system finally sent the call to voicemail. A heavy silence descended over the kitchen again, broken only by the howling wind outside. We waited, our eyes glued to the dark screen of the device. 2 minutes later, a small notification tone chimed through the quiet house. She had left an audio message. I unlocked the screen, navigated to the voicemail inbox, and pressed the speaker icon. The audio began with a sharp, ragged intake of breath. Then my mother's voice filled the room. It was not the polished, condescending tone she used at country club dinners, or the icy, authoritative voice she commanded in public. It was the sound of a woman whose entire universe was collapsing in real time. She sounded completely unhinged. "Sydney, pick up the phone," Patricia began, her voice cracking with forced theatrical tears. "Pick up the phone right now. You have absolutely no idea what you are doing. Richard's lawyers just called us. They told us about the motions your lunatic attorney filed. They told us about the bank statements and some ridiculous fabricated tape you claim to have found." I leaned closer to the phone, listening to the sheer panic vibrating underneath her words. She was trying to maintain her authoritative facade, but the terror was bleeding through every single syllable. "We can fix this, Sydney," my mother continued, her tone shifting abruptly into a frantic, breathless plea. "You do not need to involve federal prosecutors. You do not need to ruin your own family over a misunderstanding. If it is money you want, we can give you money. Richard and I talked. We are willing to liquidate half of your grandmother's estate right now. We will transfer the cash directly into your account by tomorrow morning. You can keep the foreclosure house. You can have whatever you want. Just tell your lawyer to withdraw the motions. Destroy that tape, Sydney. Burn those bank records and we will make you richer than you could ever imagine." Nia scoffed quietly from across the kitchen island, shaking her head in pure disgust. They were trying to buy their way out of a federal indictment. They genuinely thought they could just write a massive check to erase identity theft, forgery, and wire fraud. On the recording, the brief pause in my mother's frantic bargaining was followed by a heavy, shuddering breath. When she realized I was not going to pick up the line and interrupt her voicemail, the desperate, pleading mother act instantly vanished. The mask slipped completely, revealing the vicious, cornered predator underneath. "Listen to me, you ungrateful little brat," Patricia hissed into the receiver, her voice dropping into a dark, venomous snarl. "You think you are so smart hiding in that dilapidated house. We know Nia is with you. Preston came home and found his safe smashed to pieces. We know that scheming, backstabbing accountant helped you steal his private documents." I felt my jaw clench. Nia stood perfectly still, her expression hardening into absolute stone as she listened to her mother-in-law spew venom over the speaker. "You think handing those files to a lawyer makes you untouchable?" Patricia screamed, her voice echoing shrilly through the phone. If you do not drop this case, if you hand my son over to the authorities, I swear to you, Sydney, you will regret it for the rest of your miserable life. And Nia will pay the highest price of all. We know people in this city. We have connections you cannot even begin to comprehend. We can make that woman disappear so fast her own family will not even know where to look. If you ruin Preston, we will end her. Do you hear me? We will end her. Drop the case by morning, or I promise you neither of you will be safe. The voicemail ended with a sharp, violent click. The threatening silence rushed back into the kitchen heavier and far more dangerous than before. My mother had just escalated from financial bribery to a direct, explicit death threat against my sister-in-law. She had permanently crossed the line from a desperate white-collar criminal to a violent, unhinged threat. I looked up at Nia. I expected to see fear in her eyes. I expected her to panic to suggest we pack our bags and run to a hotel. Instead, Nia reached across the counter, grabbed my coffee mug, and took a slow, deliberate sip. She is terrified, Nia said, her voice possessing a chilling, absolute calm. That is not the sound of a woman who has dangerous connections. That is the sound of a woman who knows she is going to spend the last decades of her life in a federal prison cell wearing an orange jumpsuit. I looked down at my phone. The audio file was sitting in my inbox, a perfect digitized confession of witness tampering, bribery, and terroristic threats. My parents were so blinded by their arrogance and their desperate need to protect Preston that they had completely forgotten how the law worked. They had just handed me the weapon to ensure they were denied bail. I tapped the screen, saving the audio file directly to my local drive. I immediately uploaded a backup copy to a secure cloud server, ensuring that even if they managed to break into my house and destroy my phone, the evidence would survive. Then I opened my email client and drafted a new message to Bradley. I attached the audio file. The subject line was simple and direct. Add felony witness tampering and death threats to the indictment list. I hit send. The digital swoosh of the outgoing message felt like a heavy steel door slamming shut on my family's future. Nia and I did not need to run. We did not need to hide. We had the high ground, and my mother had just supplied the final piece of ammunition we needed to bury them completely. The civil trial was no longer just about property rights, it was about to become the stage for their total and absolute destruction. The heavy oak doors of the county courthouse swung open, and the suffocating tension of the last several months finally crystallized into a single sterile room. I sat at the defense table next to Bradley, my hands folded tightly in my lap. Nia sat directly behind me in the gallery, a silent, unmovable force of solidarity. The air in the courtroom smelled of lemon polish and old paper. The judge, a stern man with decades of experience etched into his face, took his seat at the bench. A few moments later, the plaintiffs arrived. Richard, Patricia, and Preston walked down the center aisle, and my stomach immediately turned at the sheer theatricality of their entrance. They had dressed specifically for the occasion, shedding their usual flashy, aggressive displays of wealth for something far more calculated. Richard wore a conservative, understated gray suit. Patricia had opted for a modest, high-necked dress, her hair pulled back into a simple, elegant style. Preston walked slightly behind them, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. He wore a subdued navy blazer and carried a leather notebook. He did not look like the arrogant fraud who had screamed threats in a bank lobby or thrown a brick through my window. He looked like a wounded, exhausted young man who had been terribly wronged by a vindictive sibling. They were playing the part of the perfect, respectable, heartbroken American family with terrifying precision. Their lead attorney stood up to deliver his opening statement. He paced the floor in front of the judge, his voice echoing with manufactured sorrow. He painted a masterful, entirely fabricated portrait of a family torn apart by the greed of a single estranged daughter. He described Preston as a hard-working, struggling entrepreneur who was just trying to build a future relying on the quiet, loving support of his aging parents. Then he pointed directly at me. He told the judge that I was a cold, calculating real estate appraiser who had weaponized my professional access to monitor my own family's financial struggles. He claimed I swooped into a public auction, like a vulture stealing my grandmother's legacy out from under my brother's feet, in a deliberate act of sabotage and jealousy. It was a brilliant opening narrative. If I had not known the absolute truth, I might have actually believed him. The opposing counsel called Patricia to the witness stand first. My mother walked up the wooden steps, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the whole truth. The moment she sat down, the award-winning performance truly began. Patricia gripped the edges of the witness stand, her voice trembling just the right amount. When her lawyer asked her about my grandmother, Patricia pulled a white tissue from her pocket and dabbed carefully at the corners of her eyes. Beatrice was the heart of our family, Patricia testified, her voice cracking with perfectly timed emotion. When her mind began to fail, when the dementia took hold, it was the hardest decision of our lives to place her in a memory care facility. We visited her constantly. We wanted to protect her home, to keep it in the family, so Preston could raise his future children there. The lawyer asked her why the house went into foreclosure. Patricia let out a long, shuddering sigh. We were overwhelmed with her medical bills. Patricia lied flawlessly under oath. We were doing everything we could to keep her comfortable. We thought we had a private arrangement with the bank to restructure the debt and secure the property for Preston. We never imagined that our own daughter Sydney was quietly tracking the delinquency. Sydney never visited her grandmother. She only cared about the property value. She used her insider knowledge to hijack the auction before we could finalize our family arrangement. I sat at the defense table, my fingernails biting so deeply into my palms they almost drew blood. I watched my mother cry real physical tears over a woman she had maliciously locked away and financially starved. I watched her look at the judge with the wide, desperate eyes of a betrayed parent. The judge leaned forward, his expression softening with undeniable sympathy. Richard took the stand next. He was the perfect counterbalance to Patricia's emotional distress. He played the role of the exhausted stoic patriarch who was simply trying to keep his family intact. When asked about the forged family trust, Richard did not even blink. He looked the judge dead in the eye and swore that Beatrice had begged him to set up the trust. My mother knew that Sydney was entirely focused on money, Richard testified, his voice heavy with fabricated regret. She specifically requested that I establish the Hayes Family Heritage Trust to protect the house from being liquidated. She wanted Preston to have it. She signed those documents in her right mind because she knew Preston would honor her legacy while Sydney would just flip the property for a quick commission. We are only in this courtroom today because I am trying to honor my mother's dying wish against a daughter who has lost her way. It was a masterclass in sociopathy. They sat under oath and spun a fairy tale of parental sacrifice, completely erasing the reality of the stolen Social Security number, the massive commercial debt they forced onto my clean credit, and the violent death threats they had hurled over the phone just days prior. Preston sat at the plaintiff's table, occasionally wiping a fake tear from his cheek, looking at his parents with a manufactured expression of profound gratitude. I glanced at the judge. He was taking copious notes, nodding along as Richard spoke about the sanctity of family promises. The opposing counsel was practically glowing, pacing the courtroom with the confident strut of a lawyer who knew he was absolutely dominating the room. The atmosphere was heavy, suffocating, and entirely stacked against me. They were winning the narrative. They were successfully painting me as a bitter rogue operator who had terrorized a loving family. I turned my head slightly to look at Bradley. My ruthless, highly expensive litigator was simply sitting back in his leather chair. He had not raised a single objection. He had not interrupted a single lie. He was just tapping his expensive silver pen against his legal pad, a look of mild, detached amusement on his face. He was letting them dig the hole as deep as they possibly could. He was letting them build their entire case on a foundation of spectacular, verifiable perjury. The opposing counsel finished his direct examination of Richard, thanking him with a sympathetic nod. He turned to the judge, a smug smile plastered across his face, clearly believing the civil trial was already effectively over. He walked back to his table and sat down next to Preston, patting his client on the shoulder, In a gesture of premature victory, the judge looked over at our table. Does the defense have any witnesses they would like to call at this time? The judge asked his tone, suggesting he did not believe anything we presented could possibly overcome the emotional weight of my parents' testimony. I took a deep, steadying breath. The suffocating tension in the room had reached its absolute peak. My parents had played their hand flawlessly. Now it was our turn. Bradley pushed his chair back, the leather creaking slightly in the hushed courtroom. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a terrifyingly calm precision. "Yes, Your Honor," Bradley said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room. "The defense calls Nia to the stand." Preston's head snapped toward the gallery so violently I thought his neck might break. He stared at his wife, expecting her to look confused or look to him for direction. Instead, Nia stood up. She smoothed the skirt of her sharp, tailored suit and walked with absolute unbothered poise down the center aisle. "What are you doing?" Preston hissed, half rising from his chair, his face entirely devoid of color. "Get back to your seat. Sit down and remain silent, or I will have you removed," the judge barked, banging his gavel. Nia did not even glance at her husband. She stepped up to the witness box, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. When she sat down, the entire energy of the courtroom shifted. She was a Black woman who had spent years operating in the highest tiers of corporate accounting, and she radiated an impenetrable, lethal competence. "Can you state your profession and your relationship to the plaintiff?" Bradley asked, stepping out from behind the defense table. "I am a certified public accountant," Nia answered, her voice ringing clear and steady. "And I am the legal spouse of Preston." "And in your professional and personal capacity, are you familiar with the financial standing of Preston Holdings, LLC? "Intimately," Nia replied. "My husband's businesses generate zero legitimate revenue. They are entirely funded by commercial loans fraudulently obtained using a stolen Social Security number belonging to his sister, Sydney." The courtroom erupted into a frenzy of murmurs. The opposing counsel leaped out of his chair, his face glistening with sweat. "Objection, Your Honor. This is outrageous hearsay. This is a civil real estate dispute. I have the bank statements, origination documents, and the IP logs, proving the applications were submitted from my husband's home office." Nia continued smoothly, talking right over the frantic lawyer. "I pulled them directly from his personal safe." Bradley approached the bench, handing a thick stack of verified financial documents to the judge. "Your Honor, these records also detail the movement of those stolen funds directly into offshore accounts controlled by Richard and Patricia." The judge put his reading glasses on his eyes, scanning the documents. The color began to drain from his face. "Overruled," he said to the opposing counsel, his tone dropping to a dangerous register. "The witness will continue." Bradley turned back to Nia. "Can you tell the court what you found in a safe deposit box registered to your husband?" "Using my legal spousal access, I inspected the box last week," Nia testified, her eyes locking onto my parents. "Inside, I found the original forged trust documents regarding Beatrice Hayes's estate. The signature was blatantly fabricated and backdated by 3 weeks at time when Beatrice was already under a legally binding medical proxy in a locked memory care ward." Richard gripped the edge of his table, his knuckles bone white. Patricia looked like she was about to hyperventilate. Their perfect, respectable facade was shattering into a million pieces in real time. "Your Honor," Bradley said, his voice echoing in the stunned courtroom. "We submit into evidence audio recordings salvaged from Beatrice Hayes's residence. These recordings were hidden by the deceased prior to her forced institutionalization." Bradley pressed a button on his laptop. The courtroom speakers hissed with static. Then my grandmother's frail, desperate voice filled the room, warning me to take the tape to a lawyer and burn them to the ground. That was immediately followed by the crisp, undeniable sound of my father plotting to starve the property of taxes, Preston whining about his ruined credit, and my mother casually suggesting they steal my Social Security number. The silence in the room was absolute. The opposing counsel sank back into his chair, staring at his clients with a look of profound horror. He had been completely blindsided by his own client's criminality. "I have one final piece of audio evidence," Bradley announced. He clicked the mouse again. My mother's unhinged screaming voicemail from just a few nights ago echoed off the high ceilings. The entire room listened as Patricia offered to bribe me with half the estate's stolen cash before pivoting to a vicious, explicit death threat against Nia. "We will make that woman disappear. If you ruin Preston, we will end her." The judge took off his glasses. He looked at my parents and my brother with a mixture of absolute disgust and fury. He slammed his gavel down so hard it echoed like a gunshot. "This civil proceeding is halted immediately," the judge thundered. "The evidence presented in this room today outlines a massive, coordinated conspiracy involving federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, felony perjury, and terroristic threats. I am turning this entire docket over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation." He gestured sharply to the bailiffs and the court security officers stationed by the doors. "Take them into custody. Nobody leaves this table." Panic erupted. Preston shot out of his chair, scrambling backward. "Nia, please," he begged, his voice cracking with pathetic, raw desperation as an officer grabbed his arms. "Tell them it is a misunderstanding. I am your husband. Please." Nia looked down at him from the witness stand. With slow, deliberate precision, she slid her diamond wedding ring off her finger. She dropped it onto the wooden ledge of the stand. It hit the wood with a sharp, final clink. "You were a parasite," Nia said coldly. "And I am the exterminator." Handcuffs clicked loudly around Richard and Patricia's wrists. My mother thrashed against the officer holding her, her carefully styled hair falling wildly across her face. She glared at me, her eyes burning with pure, unadulterated venom. "You ungrateful wretch!" Patricia screamed, her voice hoarse and desperate. "We gave you life. You are nothing without this family. You hear me? Nothing." I stood up slowly from the defense table. I did not feel angry. I did not feel sad. I felt a profound, beautiful emptiness where the weight of their expectations had burdened me for 30 years. I walked over to where the three of them were being corralled by the officers. I looked my mother dead in the eye, offering her a cold, razor-sharp smile. "The house is mine," I said, my voice perfectly steady, slicing through her hysteria like a blade. "Preston's fake company belongs to the bank, and your new home is a federal prison cell. Goodbye." I turned my back on them and never looked back. Nia stepped down from the witness stand and joined me at the center aisle. The sound of my family's screaming faded into background noise as we pushed open the heavy oak doors of the courtroom. We walked down the long corridor side by side, leaving the wreckage of their lives behind us. We pushed through the front doors of the courthouse and stepped out into the blinding Chicago sunlight. The air felt incredibly crisp and clean. The war was over, and we were finally unconditionally free. Looking back on the wreckage of my parents' pristine, fabricated empire, the greatest lesson I learned was that sharing DNA does not obligate you to be collateral damage. For 30 years, I was conditioned to believe that family loyalty meant silent compliance, that setting myself on fire to keep my brother warm was simply the cost of admission to their affection. I was completely wrong. True family is not built on a foundation of blind obedience, forged signatures, or stolen identities. It is built on mutual respect, unwavering integrity, and the absolute courage to protect one another from harm. As I sit in the fully renovated living room of my grandmother's house today, the shattered glass and plaster dust are long gone, replaced by warmth and bright sunlight. Nia is sitting across from me at the kitchen island, reviewing the initial business financials for our newly launched joint real estate consulting firm. She and I forged a bond born in the intense fires of their betrayal, and we emerged as sisters not by blood but by choice. We learned the hard way that when the people who are supposed to protect you become the predators, you have to become the architect of your own rescue. You never have to accept the role of the quiet victim in someone else's toxic narrative. You hold the power to shatter their illusions and rebuild a life that is authentically, unapologetically yours. If you have ever had to sever ties with toxic relatives to protect your own peace, share your story in the comments below.